What's up, everybody? My name is Max Kinchin. I'm a sometimes filmmaker and screenwriter, and far more often film talker about her, and this is a kitchen sink production. So, I just had a chance to see the legacy sequel, Exorcist Believer, and aside from being a big muddled mess that wasted a lot of potential and interesting concepts, including the invocation of the original Exorcist movie, watching it also made me note a very present and not so good trend that I've seen in a lot of legacy sequels lately. Before we get into that, though, please leave a like and a subscribe so Doug and I can keep bringing you sequels to these videos and build up our legacy. So I'll be honest, I am a sucker for the potential of a good legacy sequel. It's a mostly cynical gimmick that is really done just to make money, and I totally am rooting for it. I love the idea of seeing an old classic character passing the torch to a new generation, and any chance to see a beloved character back on screen, I'm going to pay that money to see it. I'm a sucker, and that's okay. And I'm always hopeful that it's going to be good until I'm proven wrong, kind of like I was in Exorcist Believer. See, I noticed in Exorcist Believer, and in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and the Star Wars sequel trilogy, and The Flash, and just about every other legacy sequel that I've seen recently, the writers seem very excited to bring the classic, now gray and white haired characters back, but they don't actually seem to know what to do with them or give their characters anywhere new to go. Since, in the majority of the time, those stories ended the last time we saw those characters when they were the main characters of their movies. So, what do the writers do? They take the closure that the characters achieved from their last movies and they take it away, so that when they start this movie, they're in a low, lonely, and sad place, and over the course of the new movie, they're redeemed and then get basically the same closure back again, and the writers can call it development or an arc. It's the easiest and laziest storytelling convention for legacy characters, and it's downright narrative elder abuse. And it's really common, and I can't unsee it now that I've seen it. So I'll just say it. Save our geriatric characters' closures, or don't bring them back at all. Major spoiler warning for the Exorcist reboot sequel. But The Exorcist Believer brings Regan MacNeil's mother, Chris, back at the midpoint of this semi-sequel / reboot of the original. She's older, wiser, and is now an expert in possessions and exorcisms across different religions and cultures because of what happened to her daughter. Only she's sad and alone because guess what? Off-screen, for nebulous reasons at best, she and Regan are now estranged, and Chris doesn't know where Regan is despite all that they went through together. This isn't actually a factor in the main story that we're watching. But moving towards a reconciliation is the arc that they have set up for Chris to justify bringing her back into an Exorcist movie after 50 years. Now, major spoiler, but I'll give you two guesses as to what the final shot of this movie is. That's right, it's a cameo by Linda Blair as Regan and Chris are reunited after Chris just happens to kind of be adjacent and not really affect the main story of the Exorcist movie that we're watching in 2023. At the end of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Indy was reunited with the love of his life, Marion Ravenwood, and the final scene was the two of them getting married and riding off to live their happy lives together with their son, Shia LaBeouf, in tow. Take a guess where Dial of Destiny starts. Indy is once again single, living alone in a shitty New York apartment, and Marion has left him. Oh yeah, and Shia LaBeouf's mutt character is dead. All of this happened off-screen so that Indy could start in a new low place and the movie could lift him out of it by giving him back what he already had by the end of the previous one. Just like Exorcist Believer, the happy ending closure moment that we get at the end of Dial of Destiny is Marion walking back into Indy's life and them living happily ever after once more. It's the same closure as the last one, only Mutt is still dead, and Indy is now notably worse off than he was 15 years ago. But again, the easiest way to develop a legacy character is to take it all away from them just so they can get some form of it back and call that a happy ending. Speaking of Harrison Ford, in Blade Runner 2049, Deckard is living alone out in the desert, having lost whatever happiness he once had from the ending of the original movie's Unicorn Escape. While Sean Young's Rachel was confirmed to be a replicant by the "it's too bad she won't live" line, and thus would not have been alive 30 years later in the sequel, the beauty of the ending of the original is the ambiguity and the hint and hope for a happy resolution for the two of them. By confirming her being gone and banishing Deckard to the desert, all that ambiguity and closure is taken away from the legacy hero once more, only for it to be given back to Deckard again in the final moments of 2049, with him reuniting with his and Rachel's daughter. Terminator Dark Fate literally undoes the ending of Terminator 2 by killing John Connor in front of Linda Hamilton, turning her Sarah into a burned-out, gray-haired, angry lady with no true life's purpose aside from blowing up robots, until she connects with the next savior of humanity in this timeline and winds up riding off in the modern day to continue the quest she was already on, putting her in the exact same position she ended T2 in, just with a different youthful savior at her side. Michael Keaton's Batman had hung up the cowl and become a burnout for unknown reasons when Barry Allen finds him in The Flash, which then compels him to shrug off whatever his issues were and get nuts once again. The Ghostbusters are split up and all hate each other until they're called to reunite and reconcile with the ghost of Spangler in the third act of the Ghostbusters Afterlife movie. Jeff Bridges' Kevin Flynn has once again somehow gotten himself trapped in the Tron world and become estranged from his son in the process between the movies of Tron and Tron Legacy, only for them to reunite and find a connection once more by the end. Danny Torrance is a worse alcoholic than his father ever was at the start of Dr. Sleep. I could go on. And then, of course, there's the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which is probably the most egregious example of this phenomenon, which seems to be centered around Harrison Ford characters now that I think about it. At the end of Return of the Jedi, Han, Luke, and Leia are all content, having earned perfect ends to their arcs by the time the Ewok party rolls around. They're literally dancing with closure and the end of their particular parts in this saga. By the time we see them again in The Force Awakens, though, all that is gone so they can get some form of the exact same things back. Han's character has actually reset to how he was when we first meet him in A New Hope. He's split from Leia and is once again a rogue, solo smuggler whose only concern seems to be money, until he finds a larger purpose again in the New Rebellion by helping Rey and Finn. Leia is similar. She's lost Han. All her political power seems to have dried up, and even the stability that she earned for the galaxy at the end of the first trilogy is gone, only so she can reconnect with Han and regain her standing as a leader of the New Rebellion against the Empire. I mean, resistance against the First Order. And yeah, Luke too. Oh God, Luke. He was the face of the rebellion, the first of the new Jedi. At the end of Return, he's looking out at the Force ghosts of his Jedi mentors and his father, imagining all of the potential this new galaxy and his new Jedi Order could bring, only for him to have lost all of that by the time we really catch up with him in The Last Jedi. The writers took all of his heroism and accomplishments away from him just so that he could overcome the guilt of almost killing his nephew for reasons, and then rediscover himself as the Jedi he was always meant to be, the hero, the face of the rebellion, standing against the evil Empire once more. Seriously, however you feel about The Last Jedi or the Star Wars sequels trilogy, they did Luke so dirty, just so they could essentially bring him back to where he was by the end of Return of the Jedi, and then kill him so that he's the Force ghost at the end of this saga. Yeah, I got feelings about that. In so many cases of these legacy sequels too, the losing everything just to get it all back for an arc's sake convention doesn't even end up having anything to do with the main story of the movie that we're watching, which further begs the question of why these legacy characters needed to be dragged back into these particular stories at all. This is most noticeable in both Exorcist Believer and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. In both cases, when Reagan shows up in Chris's hospital room at the end, and when Marion walks back into Indy's apartment, these events are not really caused by the events of the movie we just watched. The estranged characters just sort of show up at the end, not even seeming to be fully aware of what's just happened, and there's no real connection to the arc or potential redemption that the main legacy character just achieved with this reunion. The way it plays out, Marianne and Reagan could have just walked back in on any given day, but we're sort of tricked into getting that satisfaction because the reunion just happens to occur at the end of this particular movie, not because of it. This leaves those feel-good moments of reconciliation feeling kind of hollow and definitely unearned when you look at it with any sort of scrutiny. Now, while I've just laid out what appears to be the overall blueprint for handling these legacy characters' so-called arcs, there's obviously some variation. If the legacy character doesn't get their reunion moment at the end of the movie, there's a good chance they still find their redemption from whatever off-screen transgression the writers are punishing them for, and then they get what we call in the biz, fridged. Fridging usually refers to female characters dying or being injured or tortured as a motivation to keep the male protagonist motivated to complete his and the plot's objective. It doesn't refer to when your character is inside of a fridge during a nuclear explosion but doesn't die, although that has already happened to a Harrison Ford legacy character. I think it's safe to include this new legacy character permutation of the fridging convention that covers elderly legacy characters under the Fridging Terms umbrella. They bring the legacy character back, take away their closure, have them meet the new hero who brings them that closure again, and then they die to keep the new heroes going. This is done, of course, to Han Solo in Force Awakens, Flynn in Tron Legacy, to a degree Rocky in Creed 1, and they somehow managed to both fridge and unearned reunion Chris in Exorcist Believer. Kind of impressive, actually, given how ineffective it wound up being to the story. Now, having said all of this, I want to mention the one legacy sequel that has managed to not fall into these easy narrative traps, which may be why it is hands down the best of the legacy sequels as a result. I'm talking, of course, about Top Gun Maverick. While you may be able to argue that the character of Maverick hasn't really changed much at all since we last saw him 40 years before, his reappearance in Maverick works much better than those other legacy sequels because firstly, he's still doing what we saw him doing the last time he was on screen. Nothing's been taken away from him, and the only real challenge he's facing is that people think he shouldn't be doing the same things he's been doing since we last saw him. But secondly, and more importantly, Maverick doesn't actually get closure from the guilt of Goose's death at the end of the original Top Gun, so his reconciliation with Rooster, Goose's son, is still a continuation of his emotional arc and winds up bringing him the closure that he didn't get at the end of the first one. And that's not just because his character in the first one was actually very thinly written, I swear. So there was a place for Maverick's character to go without things needing to be taken away from him first. There was still more story to be told about him and a place for him to go as a character, which meant that the arc that we saw him go through this one felt new and different and completed what started in the first one, making it a much more satisfying story to watch. So with the lesson of the story success of Top Gun Maverick in mind, I think it's safe to say that we don't need to stop bringing beloved Octagenerian characters back for legacy sequels, but there needs to be a damn good reason to bring them back, and it can't just be to take away what they already achieved just to give it back to them, because you want the original characters on screen when you're rebooting or sequelizing a franchise. They need to have something to do. But why not just have it be a cameo if you don't have anything better for Harrison Ford? Most legacy sequels are about passing the torch anyway. Before his character got all muddled in Last Jedi, the use of Luke as a 3-second cameo at the very end of Force Awakens was actually a pretty effective way to use this character. The movie was about finding him, sure, but still, we got a different story with different characters, and yet his name and eventual cameo still kept us grounded in the story and told us that we were still in Star Wars. I'm just saying, you can have a legacy sequel in the same world and let us know that our old friends are still out there, but let a totally new story be told instead of just making the lives of our old heroes so much worse just because there's nothing else for them to do. I'm saying it. As a writer and a fan of the potential of a legacy sequel, writers, if you don't have a more new story for your legacy character to go through, just make it a cameo and tell a new story with the characters as the sole focus. As we saw that trying to have 2 possessed girls seemed to muddle up Exorcist Believer, instead of just the one like the original, just stick to the one story. Not 2. Don't do both. Don't tell a legacy character's retread story in the legacy sequel if it's supposed to be its own thing, or you'll end up with the unfocused mess and waste of potentially good ideas that was the Exorcist Believer, which also wasted both the invocation of the original Exorcist and the appearances of the untouchable cinematic horror characters that are Reagan and Chris MacNeil. Happy Halloween. Tail slates.